The old manila envelope was surprisingly heavy in his hands, weighted not by paper, but by the years he had carried its promise like a stone in his heart. My father, a man of few words and even fewer overt displays of emotion, had pressed it into my hand the day before my wedding. His knuckles were gnarled from a life of hard work, his eyes clear and direct. "Alex," he'd said, his voice a low rumble, "you love this girl. I see it. But life has a way of testing love. If she ever betrays you, truly breaks your trust, you give her this. Not before, not in anger over some small thing, only if the foundation cracks." Last night the foundation had not just cracked, it had been dynamited into dust. I saw her, Isabella, my wife of 5 years. I saw her on the rain-slicked terrace of a hotel I knew I couldn't afford, wrapped in the arms of a man whose suit cost more than my car. I hadn't meant to be there. A last-minute consultation for a potential client, a small structural survey for a renovation. I was still in my work boots, my jacket smelling faintly of plaster dust in damp concrete, and I looked up, following the sound of laughter, a silvery, familiar peal that twisted in my gut like a knife. And there she was, her head thrown back, her face, the face I woke up to every morning, illuminated by the soft glow of the hotel lights, radiant with a joy I hadn't seen directed at me in years. The man she was with, tall and broad-shouldered, leaned down and kissed her. It was not a furtive peck. It was a kiss of ownership, of long-established intimacy. And she did not just accept it, she rose on her toes to meet it, her hands sliding up his chest. The world went silent, the city noise, the drizzle, the pounding in my own ears. It all faded away to a dull, distant hum. I just stood there, a ghost in the street, watching the life I thought I had being lived by someone else, in a place I didn't belong. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I simply turned and walked away, each step a deliberate, methodical movement away from the blast zone. Now, sitting in the stillness of the home that was no longer a home, the envelope lay on the polished oak of the dining table. The table Isabella had picked out, calling it impeccably sophisticated. The chairs she'd insisted on, which were unforgivingly chic. My entire life, it seemed, was furnished with her vocabulary. My father was gone now, 2 years past. I couldn't ask him what was inside. I couldn't ask for his guidance, only follow the strange, posthumous instruction. He had never liked Isabella's family, their casual cruelty dressed up as wit, their obsession with the glittering, brittle shell of high society. He saw the way they looked at me, at my profession, an architect. To them, I was a glorified tradesman, a necessary but unglamorous cog in the machine of their world. A good, solid boy, they'd say, with a good, solid, but ultimately limited future. My father saw it all, and he gave me this envelope. My fingers trembled as I worked a thumb under the flap. The glue was old and brittle, giving way with a dry, tearing sound. It felt final, irreversible. I had been instructed to give it to her, but my father was a strategist. He wouldn't have armed me without letting me see the weapon first. Last night, I had opened it. I had sat right here in this very chair and pulled out the contents. And in the silent, lonely hours before dawn, I finally understood. My father had not given me a shield. He had given me a sword and a map of exactly where to plunge it. It's a strange thing to have your world fall apart and be rebuilt in the space of a single night. To look at the ruins of your life and find, buried in the rubble, the blueprints for a fortress. If you've ever had a moment like that, a moment where everything you thought was true turned out to be a lie, but that lie revealed an even deeper truth, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear where you're watching from, to know I'm not alone in this. Because tonight, the story isn't just about a betrayal, it's about a reckoning. Let's go back a year, to the beginning of the end, though I was too blind to see it then. The scene was a dinner party, one of many hosted by Isabella's parents, Marcus and Eleanor Vance. Their home was less a house and more a monument to wealth, a sprawling contemporary mansion of glass and white stone that always felt cold, no matter the season. It was designed to intimidate, to remind every guest of their place in the Vance's orbit. My place, it was always made clear, was in a distant, barely detectable ellipse. "Alex, darling," Eleanor trilled, her voice as sharp and thin as the champagne flute she held. She glided towards me, a shimmering vision in silk, her eyes doing a quick, dismissive scan of my off-the-rack suit. "So good of you to make it. Isabella was just saying how busy you are with your little projects." The condescension was so routine it was almost comfortable. I was a senior partner and lead designer at a firm I had co-founded, but in their world I was perpetually a junior architect working on little projects. It was a narrative they had created, and one Isabella never corrected. "They keep me busy, Eleanor," I said with a calm smile. "It was a game, and the first rule was to never let them see you sweat." Marcus, a bulldog of a man poured into an expensive suit, clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder. "That's the spirit, hard work, good for the soul. Isn't that right, Julian?" He barked a laugh at his son. Julian, Isabella's younger brother, smirked from across the room. He had the family's arrogance without any of Marcus's business acumen, a dangerous combination. "Absolutely, Dad, though some of us prefer to work smart, not hard." He raised his glass in a mock toast to me. The insult was clear. I was the diligent but dim-witted worker bee, while he was the clever prince. I saw Isabella watching the exchange from her position beside a towering floral arrangement. She looked exquisite, as always, in a dress that probably cost more than the first car I ever owned. A flicker of something, discomfort, guilt, crossed her face before it was smoothed over with a practiced, brilliant smile. She didn't defend me. She never did. Her loyalty was to the glittering cage she was born in, not to the man who shared her bed. To intervene would be to admit that their barbs found their mark, and that would be a social misstep. In her world, you didn't acknowledge wounds. You simply pretended you were never hit. Later, gathered around the colossal dining table, the conversation turned to a recent acquisition Marcus had made, a portfolio of commercial properties in the city's burgeoning tech district. He spoke of it with the swagger of a conquering general. "It was a steal," he boomed, gesturing with a fork. "The fools who owned it were practically giving it away. No vision. You need vision in this game, Alex. The ability to see what something can be, not just what it is." He looked at me, a glimmer of challenge in his eyes. I felt a familiar, cold calm settle over me. It was the same feeling I got when looking at a complex design problem, a sense of seeing all the angles, all the load-bearing points and structural weaknesses. I let the silence hang for a beat before I answered. "Vision is essential, Marcus," I agreed, my voice even. "But a foundation is just as important. If the bedrock is unstable, even the most beautiful skyscraper will eventually collapse." He stared at me, momentarily thrown by the directness of the analogy. Julian snickered. "Listen to him, Dad. The builder is giving us lessons in business." Isabella shot me a look. It was the look I'd come to dread, a silent plea. Don't do this here. Just smile and nod. Play the part." So I did. I gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "Just thinking in terms I understand, Julian." "Exactly," Marcus said, recovering his bluster, waving his hand dismissively. "Stick to your blueprints, son. Leave the real world to us." The table laughed. It was a polite, choreographed sound, the laughter of people reinforcing their own superiority. Isabella's laugh was the lightest, but it was there. It joined the chorus that marked me as other, as less. I reached down and my hand brushed against the worn leather of my briefcase, propped against my chair. Inside, Nestled between schematics for a new municipal library and a feasibility study for a low-income housing project was the envelope. In that moment, I touched it through the leather, a subconscious gesture of seeking an anchor in a hostile sea. My father had known. He had seen this exact dynamic, this slow, grinding erosion of dignity, and he had prepared for it. What they didn't know, what Isabella didn't know, was that the little project I was so busy with was the final due diligence on a silent, controlling interest purchase of the very architectural firm Marcus had contracted to design his new flagship tower. What they didn't know was that the fools who sold Marcus that property portfolio had done so on my advice, cashing out at the peak of the market before a zoning change I was aware of would render the land half as valuable. What they didn't know was that my good, solid, limited future was a carefully constructed facade, a wall behind which I was building an empire based on a simple principle my father had taught me. Let them underestimate you. It's the greatest advantage you'll ever have. I took a slow sip of the ridiculously expensive wine they were serving. It tasted of ashes. I looked at my beautiful wife, laughing at her father's joke at my expense, and for the first time, I didn't just feel hurt. I felt a profound tectonic shift inside me. The foundation wasn't mine. It was hers, and I was beginning to see the cracks. The following spring, Isabella decided we needed a vacation. Or rather, her family was going on their annual retreat to St. Bart's, and it was simply assumed we would join. The resort was a breathtakingly beautiful prison of white sand and turquoise water, owned, of course, by a subsidiary of Vance Global. From the moment we arrived, I was cast in my familiar role, the awkward, out-of-place appendage to the radiant Isabella Vance. "Just try to relax, Alex," she'd said as we walked into our suite. It was larger than our first apartment, with a private plunge pool and a view that was an assault of beauty. She said it with a sigh, as if my very presence was a chore she had to manage. She immediately began unpacking her arsenal of resort wear, a dozen bikinis, gossamer cover-ups, and shoes that were utterly impractical for sand. "I am relaxed," I said, placing my single, unassuming suitcase on the rack. "Are you?" She turned, hands on her hips, and gave me a look. "You have that look on your face, like you're calculating the structural integrity of the palm trees." It was meant to be a joke, a little jab, but it landed with the familiar sting of truth. I was always observing, always analyzing. It was how my mind worked. It was the quality that made me a brilliant architect, but in her world, it made me a bore. A man who couldn't simply enjoy a sunset without wondering about atmospheric particulate. The days unfolded in a predictable pattern of enforced leisure. Mornings by the pool, where Marcus held court, booming into his phone about deals and acquisitions. Afternoons on the family's chartered yacht, where Julian practiced his smarm on the crew and Eleanor complained about the temperature of the champagne. I was an island of quiet in their sea of noise. I read books. I sketched ideas for a new concert hall in my notebook. I was present, but not participating. My quiet was a provocation. They saw it as judgment, a silent critique of their loud, glittering world. They responded by trying to draw me in, usually through humiliation. One afternoon, Julian, flushed with rum and self-importance, clapped me on the back. "Alex, my man, you've been hiding away. Come on, I'm ordering a round of the good stuff. The 1942. Put it on your room, will you?" I seemed to have left my wallet upstairs. He said it loudly, in front of several of their friends who were lounging nearby. It was a power play, a small way of establishing the hierarchy. He was the one who ordered. I was the one who paid. I knew he had his wallet. I knew this was a test. Isabella, floating in the pool nearby, heard him. She looked at me over the top of her sunglasses, her expression unreadable. A word from her would have stopped it. A simple, "Don't be ridiculous, Julian. Pay for your own drinks." But she said nothing. She simply watched, waiting to see how I would handle it. I gave the waiter a polite nod. "Of course, put it on suite 301, I said, my voice steady. "And please add a 20% gratuity for your trouble." Julian laughed, a triumphant braying sound. "See, Alex is a good sport." He wasn't calling me a good sport. He was calling me a dog who knew his tricks. I paid for the exorbitant round of tequila. I paid for the privilege of being the butt of the joke. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I simply absorbed the cost. Another small debit in a ledger of indignities I was keeping in my head. Later that night, as we were getting ready for dinner, Isabella came up behind me and wrapped her arms around my waist. She rested her chin on my shoulder, looking at our reflection in the mirror. "You were very gracious today," she murmured, her voice soft. It wasn't a compliment. It was an expression of relief. I had passed her test. I had not embarrassed her by making a scene. I had played my part. "He's your brother," I said simply. "I know," she sighed. "He can be a lot. And Dad, too. They don't understand you. They don't try to, Isabella." She pulled away, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. The moment of intimacy was over. "Oh, Alex, don't be so dramatic. It's just how they are. You can't take them so seriously. Why do you always have to make everything so heavy?" Because it was heavy. Their casual dismissals, their constant belittling. It was the weight of 1,000 tiny cuts. And she was the one who handed them the knives. I didn't say any of this. I just turned and finished tying my tie. But as I stood there, looking at my own reflection, I felt a deep, chilling loneliness. I was in a paradise, surrounded by opulence, married to a beautiful woman, and I had never felt more isolated. That night while she slept, the moonlight tracing the perfect lines of her face, I slipped out onto the balcony. The air was warm and thick with the scent of salt and night-blooming jasmine. I took out my phone. It was not a social call. It was a conversation with my wealth manager, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Chen. "The final paperwork for the Helios Resorts acquisition went through, Alex," she said, her voice crisp even over the satellite connection. "We now have a controlling interest. The board is yours to command." I looked out over the ocean, at the distant lights of other islands. One of them, I knew, was home to the flagship property of Helios's main competitor, a chain owned by none other than Vance Global. "Good," I said, my voice quiet. "Phase 1 is complete. Now let's talk about Phase 2. I want to start a targeted campaign, aggressive price cuts, upgraded amenities, a new marketing push. I want to bleed the competition dry. Specifically, I want to target the St. Bart's market." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Chen knew my portfolio. She knew who I was married to. She was too professional to comment on the specifics, but she understood the implications. "That will be a direct, sustained assault on Vance Global's most profitable quarter, Alex," she said, a note of clinical curiosity in her voice. "Their margins there are thin. It could be devastating for them." "I know," I said, looking back through the glass at the sleeping form of my wife. "That's the point." I was paying for Julian's tequila, yes, but I was also quietly, methodically buying the bank that held the loan on his father's company. They thought I was a guest in their world. They had no idea I was about to become the landlord. And in my mind, I could almost feel the phantom weight of my father's envelope, a silent, steadying presence. The foundation they were all standing on was beginning to feel a lot like sand. The final dinner was meant to be a celebration, a triumph. Marcus had, after months of brutal negotiations, finally closed a deal to merge with a major German manufacturing conglomerate, a move that would supposedly catapult Vance Global into a new, unassailable stratosphere. The dinner was held at their house, the white stone and glass temple of capitalism, and the mood was electric with self-congratulation. I walked into the familiar chill of their grand foyer beside Isabella. She was incandescent, wearing a silver dress that clung to her like a second skin. She squeezed my hand, her eyes sparkling. "Isn't it wonderful, Alex? Dad is on top of the world. We're all going to be, well, even more secure." Secure. The word hung in the air. For her, security was a fortress of money and status. For me, it had always been about having a solid foundation of trust and respect, something that had long since eroded between us. The evening was a masterclass in Van's family arrogance. Marcus was holding court by the massive fireplace, pontificating about his victory. "They played hardball," he was saying to a cluster of sycophantic business partners, "but they didn't know who they were dealing with. I had an ace up my sleeve, an anonymous backer, a silent partner who saw the potential. In the end, they couldn't refuse our offer." He beamed, basking in the glow of his own perceived genius. I felt a ghost of a smile touch my lips. His ace, his silent partner. I wondered what he would think if he knew his anonymous savior was the same man his son had ordered to pay for his drinks, the same man his wife dismissed as a purveyor of little projects. The dramatic irony was so thick I could have carved it. Dinner was served. The conversation was loud, the wine flowed freely, and the air grew thick with smugness. I was seated, as usual, in the seat of least importance, next to a distant aunt who only wanted to talk about her dog's dietary needs. I was a spectator, a piece of furniture that happened to be married to the princess. Then Isabella, giddy with champagne and filial pride, turned the spotlight on me. It wasn't meant to be cruel, not exactly. It was worse. It was thoughtless. "Oh, we're making some changes at our place too," she announced to the table at large. "A little victory project of my own. I've hired an interior designer, the brilliant Antoine Dubois. We're gutting the entire apartment, starting fresh." A murmur of approval went around the table. Antoine Dubois was the designer of the moment, famously expensive and exclusive. She warmed to her theme, her voice gaining a theatrical, self-deprecating lilt that wasn't self-deprecating at all. "We're getting rid of everything, all of Alex's sentimental junk. That lumpy old armchair he inherited from his father? Gone." She laughed, a bright, tinkling sound. "The study full of his dusty books and blueprints? That's going to be my new yoga studio. A place for light and air, not calculations." The table chuckled along with her. Julian raised his glass. "To light and air, and fewer calculations." I felt nothing. That was the terrifying part. The place where hurt used to be was now a cold, smooth, empty space. The thousand cuts had cauterized the nerve. I looked at my wife, the woman who had just cheerfully announced the erasure of my identity from our shared home, the erasure of the last physical links to my dead father, and I saw a stranger. A beautiful, glittering, hollow stranger. This was it, the final, casual severing. She wasn't just dismissing my profession or my background anymore. She was dismissing my history, my grief, my very self. And she was doing it for sport, for the amusement of her family. I placed my fork and knife down on my plate, the silver making a soft, deliberate click against the porcelain. The sound was small, but in a brief lull in the conversation, it seemed to echo. Every eye turned to me. I looked at Marcus, his face flushed with wine and victory. I looked at Eleanor, her expression one of bored indulgence. I looked at Julian, a smirk already forming on his lips, anticipating my clumsy, earnest response. And finally, I looked at Isabella. Her smile faltered slightly, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The look was back. Don't ruin this. Not tonight." But it wasn't her night to ruin anymore. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The quiet before the storm. The narrator in the back of my mind was taking notes. The quality of the light from the chandelier, the scent of roasted duck and expensive perfume, the almost imperceptible tremor in Isabella's hand as she reached for her own glass. I was no longer a guest. I was no longer a son-in-law. I was a man with a set of blueprints for a demolition, and the first swing of the wrecking ball was about to be taken. I met Isabella's gaze across the table, across the wreckage of our marriage, and I gave her a small, calm, terrifyingly serene smile. The time for playing my part was over. The time for revealing the true nature of the play had just begun. "Isabella," I said, my voice not loud, but carrying in the sudden stillness of the room. "We do need to talk about the apartment." The words were simple, mundane, but the tone was not. Every person at that table, from Marcus down to the distant aunt, felt the shift in atmosphere. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Isabella forced a laugh, a brittle, nervous sound. "Darling, not now. We're celebrating." "This is a better time than you know," I replied, my gaze unwavering. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. For a moment, I think they expected a wallet, perhaps a gesture to pay for something, to re-establish my subordinate role. Instead, my hand emerged with a single, old-fashioned brass key. It was heavy, ornate, and clearly not for a modern apartment. I placed it on the white linen tablecloth in the space between our plates. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. "What's that?" Julian sneered, always ready to fill a silence with mockery. "The key to your secret diary?" "In a way," I said, not looking at him. My focus was entirely on Isabella. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the key as if it were a venomous snake. "Alex, what is this?" she whispered, the color draining from her face. "That," I said, my voice still calm, still measured, "is the master key to the Penhurst building. The building where our apartment is. The building you want to gut." I paused, letting the information settle. "You see, the problem with your plan to hire Antoine Dubois is a simple one of logistics. He can't gut a property that his client no longer has the right to occupy." A confused murmur rippled around the table. Marcus leaned forward, his jovial mask slipping into one of irritation. "What the hell are you talking about, Alex? It's her apartment. It was my wedding gift to you both." "Ah," I said, turning my attention to him for the first time. "A common misconception, Marcus, one I allowed to persist. You gave us the down payment for the apartment, a very generous gift. But you see, I paid for the rest of it, in cash. The title is, and always has been, solely in my name. And as of this morning, the 30-day eviction notice I had my lawyer draw up was delivered to the doorman. It's addressed to a Jane Doe, as per legal requirements for an unauthorized occupant. I believe that's you, Isabella." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a dozen realities simultaneously shattering. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Julian's jaw was slack. Marcus looked as if I had physically struck him. But my focus returned to Isabella. Tears were welling in her eyes, tears of shock and fury. You can't do this. This is our home." "No," I said, and the coldness in my own voice surprised me. "It was my home. To you, it was just a stage, and the set is now being struck." I reached into my pocket again. This time I brought out the envelope. My father's envelope. It was worn, soft at the edges, a relic from a different world. I held it up. "My father gave me this before our wedding," I explained to the silent, horrified audience. "He said to give it to you, Isabella, if you ever betrayed me. I saw you last night on the terrace of the St. Regis, room 1204, with him, so by all rights, this belongs to you." I held it out. She flinched back as if it were on fire. "But I'm not going to give it to you," I continued, placing it on the table next to the key. "He told me to give it to you, but I think he would have understood that some things are better explained. You see, you and your family have operated under a series of assumptions for the past 5 years. The assumption that I am poor, the assumption that I am simple, the assumption that I am weak. Tonight, I'd like to correct the record." I leaned forward, my hands clasped on the table. The verbal chess match had begun. The opening gambit was over. Now it was time to take their queen. Let's start with you, Julian. You like to joke about my calculations. Here's a calculation for you. Your line of credit at the Bellagio, the Wynn, and the Atlantis, a grand total of $1.2 million, was purchased 3 months ago by a discreet little private equity firm called Peregrine Holdings. That firm is mine. Your gambling debts? You now owe them to me, and I'm calling them in. The first payment is due Monday. Julian turned a shade of gray I had previously only seen on concrete samples. I turned to Marcus. And you, Marcus, your ace in the hole, your anonymous backer for the German merger. I let the statement hang in the air, a beautiful, terrible thing. I watched the dawning horror in his eyes as the pieces clicked into place. Peregrine Holdings again. So resourceful. You celebrated closing a deal tonight, but a deal requires all parties to sign, and my signature is contingent on a full audit of Vance Global's liabilities. An audit which, I'm sure, will uncover the fact that you've been cooking the books for the last 3 quarters to make your company seem more attractive for the merger. The very merger I financed. I picked up the key and turned it over in my fingers. You lecture me about vision, Marcus, but your vision is fatally myopic. You see the penthouse, but you ignore the foundations. You told me to stick to my blueprints. Well, I did. I just used them to build a cage around you while you were busy admiring the view. The room was a tableau of ruin. Eleanor was now openly weeping into her napkin. Marcus was staring at me, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. Julian looked like he was going to be sick. And Isabella, she was just staring at me, her beautiful face a canvas of utter devastation. The man she had married, the quiet, solid, predictable man, was gone. In his place was this stranger, this cold-eyed strategist who had just dismantled her entire world in the time it took to serve dessert. "Why?" she whispered, the word a ragged breath. "Alex, why?" I looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of the old love, a shadow of the man who would have done anything for her. But it was just a ghost. "You ask why?" I said, my voice finally losing its icy control and allowing a sliver of the deep, buried pain to surface. "You stood there year after year and watched them chip away at me. You held the chisel. You laughed when they called my father's armchair lumpy junk. That armchair was where he sat every night after a 16-hour day at the plant, his hands raw, so I could go to college and become the man you were so embarrassed by. You want to build a yoga studio where my dreams were born? That's why." I pushed my chair back and stood up. The meal was over. "The contents of this envelope," I said, tapping the manila rectangle, "are simple. It's the original deed to this house, Marcus. The one your father put up as collateral for a business loan in 1987. A loan that was quietly bought by my father, who saw the kind of man you were even then. He never called it in. He held it as a courtesy that expires, let's say, now. And it's also a detailed plan for the liquidation of all Vance Global assets, cross-referenced with every insult, every slight, every moment of condescension I have endured for the last 5 years. My father was a meticulous man." I looked around the room, at the wreckage. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was a profound, aching sadness, a sense of waste. "Enjoy your celebration," I said quietly. I turned and walked out of the dining room, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous, silent hall. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what I would see. The beautiful facade had crumbled, and for the first time, they were all seeing the rot underneath. The immediate aftermath was chaos, but it was a distant, muffled chaos, like a storm raging on the other side of a thick plate of glass. My phone began to ring almost as soon as I reached my car. First Julian, his number flashing on the screen. I ignored it. Then Eleanor. Ignored. Then a number I didn't recognize, which I knew was Marcus. borrowing someone's phone in a desperate attempt to get through. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, the unanswered call a small, satisfying act of power. The last call was from Isabella. Her name on the screen still carried a phantom pang, a muscle memory of affection. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the green icon. What could she possibly say? What apology could bridge the chasm that had just opened between us? I pictured her face, the way it had crumpled in on itself, a beautiful sculpture collapsing into clay. Part of me, the old Alex, the man who loved her, wanted to answer, to soothe, to fix. But that man was gone. He had been dismissed, belittled, and finally erased at a dinner party. In his place was the architect of her family's ruin. I silenced the call and dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. I didn't go to the apartment. It was no longer a home, just a property. Instead, I drove. I drove through the city, the familiar streets looking alien and new. The buildings I had helped design, the parks I had walked through, the bridges I had crossed 1,000 times, they all seemed to be part of a life that belonged to someone else. I was a ghost in my own city. I ended up at a quiet, unassuming hotel near the airport, a place of transient souls and no questions asked. I checked in under a false name, a precaution that felt both absurdly dramatic and deeply necessary. In the sterile anonymity of the room, I finally allowed myself to feel. Not the cold, strategic anger that had carried me through the dinner, but the deep, foundational grief of it all. I had not just ended a marriage, I had declared war. I had deployed a weapon my father had forged for 30 years, a weapon of patience, foresight, and righteous indignation. The first crack in their denial came 2 days later. It arrived not as a phone call, but as a frantic, rambling email from Isabella. The subject line was simply, "Alex, please." The tone was a chaotic mix of fury, pleading, and utter disbelief. "How could you do this to us? To me? My father is a wreck. The lawyers are crawling all over everything. They're saying the merger is off. They're saying there are irregularities. This is your fault. You planted this. You planned this. You were supposed to be my husband. You were supposed to love me. Was it all a lie? Was our whole life just some long, twisted game for you? My cards are being declined. Alex, my credit cards. I had to borrow money from a friend to buy coffee. Do you find this funny? Is this the revenge you wanted? To see me humiliated? I'm your wife. You owe me an explanation. You owe me more than this. Call me. We need to talk. I love you." The "I love you" at the end was the most pathetic and transparent part of it all. It was a key she was trying, a lock she had long since broken. I read the email twice, feeling a strange detachment. The woman who wrote this email was a stranger to me now, her problems as distant as those of a character in a novel. I deleted it without replying. The next communication was from Marcus. It was a formal letter delivered by courier from his high-priced law firm. It was full of bluster and legal threats. It accused me of corporate espionage, malicious interference, and breach of fiduciary duty. It demanded I cease and desist all actions related to Vance Global and Peregrine Holdings. It was a scare tactic, a roar from a wounded lion. My lawyer, the same calm, methodical woman who had helped me set up the entire structure, was unperturbed. "It's noise, Alex," she said over the phone. "They're flailing. Every action you took was legal, meticulously documented, and executed from a position of unassailable strength. Their case has no merit. They know it. This is just the first stage of bargaining." She was right. 2 weeks later, the roaring stopped. The threats were replaced by a different kind of communication. A handwritten note from Eleanor slipped under the door of my new office, the one I'd owned for years but had only now started using. It was a rambling, tear-stained plea for mercy. She wrote about Isabella, how she wasn't eating, how she just stared at the walls. She wrote about Marcus, about his health, the stress. She appealed to the good, kind boy she had once known. She invited me for tea to talk things through for the sake of the family. She still didn't get it. She thought family was a bond that could be invoked to paper over a betrayal. She didn't understand that they had made it clear, time and again, that I was never truly part of their family. I was a resource, a curiosity, and now a threat. I had the note shredded. The most telling silence was from Julian. No calls, no emails, no threats. Just a profound and terrified quiet. I learned from one of my contacts that he had put his prized sports car up for sale and was seen meeting with a third-rate bankruptcy lawyer. The reality of his debts, now held by an unsympathetic creditor, had apparently been a sobering experience. Then, about a month after the dinner, the true shift occurred. Marcus called my lawyer, not with threats, but with a question. He wanted to know what my terms were. It was the first sign of surrender, the first admission that I held all the cards. The bargaining had begun, and I knew exactly what I wanted. It wasn't money. I had more than enough of that. It wasn't revenge. I had discovered the act itself was a hollow, joyless thing. What I wanted was something far more valuable: accountability and a clean, untangled future. The consequences played out with the slow, inexorable logic of a collapsing building. First, the public spectacle. The society pages that had once breathlessly chronicled the Vances' every move now reported on their downfall with a kind of gleeful schadenfreude. The German merger was officially declared dead, with Vance Global's stock plummeting in its wake. Whispers of an SEC investigation into accounting irregularities turned into bold headlines. Marcus Vance, the titan of industry, was now a pariah. I watched it all from a distance, through the curated lens of news alerts and reports from my team. I felt a grim satisfaction, but it was tempered with the architect's melancholy at seeing a demolition. Even a necessary one is still an act of destruction. The private consequences were, I imagined, even more devastating. The mansion, the deed to which was now held by one of my trusts, was put on the market. The proceeds, my lawyer informed theirs, would be held in escrow against the debts Marcus had incurred, both to my father's estate and to the investors he had misled. The life of effortless luxury they had known was over. They were exposed, for the first time, to the cold winds of financial reality. It was during this period that Marcus broke. He requested a meeting, not with lawyers present, just him and me. Against my lawyer's advice, I agreed. We met in a neutral space, a small, unassuming coffee shop in a part of town they would have once considered beneath them. He looked diminished. The swagger was gone, replaced by a weary stoop in his shoulders. His expensive suit hung on him, as if he had shrunk within it. He didn't try to bluster or threaten. He just looked at me, his eyes tired. "I don't understand," he said, his voice raspy. "All this intricate, patient, long-term plan to destroy me, to destroy my family. For what? Because we were rude to you at dinner parties?" I took a sip of my coffee. It was plain, black, and bitter. "It was never about you being rude, Marcus. It was about you being blind. It was about your daughter." He flinched at the mention of Isabella. "She's a mess, Alex. You've broken her." "No," I said, my voice hard. "You broke her. You and Eleanor. You raised her in a bubble of privilege and arrogance. You taught her that people were either assets or obstacles. You taught her that appearance was everything and character was nothing. You taught her to be ashamed of a man who worked with his hands, even if he was building a life for her. I didn't break her. I just held up a mirror. And you're right, the reflection is not pretty." He was silent for a long time, stirring his own coffee, which he hadn't touched. "Her mother, Eleanor, she wants to believe this is all your fault, that you are some kind of monster who tricked us." He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than arrogance in his eyes. It was a glimmer of self-awareness. But I was there, in the boardroom. I saw the numbers you presented. I saw the web you had woven. This wasn't malice, was it? It was architecture. It was the most insightful thing he had ever said to me. It was about building on a solid foundation, I corrected gently. Something you taught me about, remember? You just had it backwards. The foundation isn't money, it's integrity, and yours was rotten. He finally met my gaze. What do you want, Alex? What will it take to make this stop? I want a divorce, I said. A clean one. Isabella signs the papers. She makes no claim on any of my assets, personal or corporate. She walks away with what she came in with. Nothing. In return, I will not pursue a total liquidation of Vance Global. I will allow the company to be restructured under a new board, one of my choosing, and I will release you from your personal guarantees on its debt. You will be left with enough to live on, comfortably, but not extravagantly. Your days as a titan are over. You'll be just a man. Maybe you'll find that's enough. He stared at me, the businessman in him calculating the odds, weighing the offer. It was a lifeline and we both knew it. A generous one under the circumstances. And what about the house? He asked quietly. My father's house. The house is not part of the deal, I said. The house is a lesson for your daughter. He slumped in his chair, defeated. He knew he had no move left to make. He had been checkmated from the beginning. It was in that moment that Marcus, the silent enabler, the man who had laughed the loudest at my expense, finally made a choice. He chose survival. He chose to throw his daughter's delusions under the bus to save himself. She'll sign, he said, his voice a ghost of his former boom. I'll make sure of it. The meeting with Isabella was the final, necessary piece of demolition. I agreed to see her, for the last time, to deliver the divorce papers myself. I chose the venue carefully, a small, public park near the apartment we once shared. A place of green things and open air, a stark contrast to the cold, opulent rooms where our marriage had died. She was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench, looking small and fragile. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. Her hair was pulled back, and without the careful mask of makeup, she looked younger and exhausted. The change was so stark, I almost didn't recognize the conquering beauty from the St. Regis Terrace. This was someone else. This was the aftermath. I sat on the other end of the bench, leaving a careful distance between us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the distant city traffic and the laughter of children playing on a nearby swing set. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet and hoarse. My father told me about your offer. It's not an offer, Isabella, I said, my own voice softer than I intended. It's the terms of our separation. She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on her hands, which were twisting a damp tissue in her lap. He said I have to sign, that if I don't, we'll lose everything. She finally looked at me, and her eyes were filled with a confusion that was, for the first time, genuine. Was it always about the money, Alex? Were you just waiting all this time? I thought about how to answer that, how to explain the slow, patient accumulation of not just wealth, but of slights, of hurts, of moments of casual cruelty. The money was never the point, I said. It was the tool. It was the language your family speaks. I had to learn to speak it fluently to be heard. Do you remember when you told me you were throwing out my father's armchair? She flinched, a small, involuntary movement. Alex, I was just talking. It was a stupid thing to say at a party. To you, it was talking, I replied. To me, it was the moment I realized you didn't see me. You never had. You saw a project, a fixer-upper you could mold into something acceptable to your world. And when you couldn't, you decided to just redecorate, throw out the old and bring in the new. Tears began to slide down her cheeks, silent and steady. I loved you, she whispered. I did. in my own way. I know, I said, and the tragedy was I believed her. Her love was just as flawed and conditional as the world she was raised in. It was a love that could not withstand the slightest social inconvenience. A love that required me to be smaller, quieter, less than I was. But your way wasn't enough. It wasn't a partnership. It was a performance. And I got tired of my role. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the divorce papers, a thick sheaf of documents that represented the formal end of our life together. I also pulled out one other thing, the old manila envelope. I placed them both on the bench between us. This is it, I said. Sign the papers and you can walk away. You'll be free. No more debts, no more advances, no more anything. A truly fresh start. Her eyes fell on the envelope. And that? The thing my father-in-law gave you? What's in there that was so terrible you couldn't show me? I picked it up. The paper was soft, almost like fabric. My father wasn't a cruel man, Isabella. He was a protector. He knew your family's world. He knew their weaknesses. What's in here isn't a weapon against you. It was a shield for me. I opened the unsealed flap and pulled out the contents. It wasn't a complex legal document. It was a simple one-page letter written in my father's familiar, strong handwriting. And tucked inside the fold was a single, tarnished key. Not the master key to the Penhurst. A small, simple house key. I handed her the letter. Her hands trembled as she took it. She read it, her eyes scanning the page, then reading it again more slowly. The letter said, "My son, if you are reading this, your heart is broken. I am sorry for that. There is no pain like it. But a man's heart can mend if its foundation is true. I have instructed you to give the envelope to your wife. If you are reading it instead, it means you are wiser than I thought. The world of your wife's family is built on sand. They value things that shine, not things that last. I have spent my life building things that last. You are the best thing I ever built. I have watched them. I know them. They will try to take everything from you, starting with your dignity. Do not let them. I have made some arrangements over the years. Quiet investments. Favors owed. I built a fortress for you, Alex. Not of stone, but of numbers in deeds and legal firewalls. Your lawyer, Miss Chen, has the blueprints. Use them to protect yourself. But protection is not the same as vengeance. Vengeance will hollow you out. The key in this letter is for the house you grew up in, the house I bought with my own 2 hands. I never sold it. It's paid for. The taxes are handled by a trust. It's small and the neighborhood is nothing special, but it is solid. It is yours. It is a place to go when you have nowhere else. A foundation. If she has broken your heart, but she is a good woman who has made a mistake, give her this letter and this key. Go to that house together and start again on solid ground. But if she has broken your trust, if she has shown herself to be one of them, then the fortress is for you alone. Tear down their paper castle, son, not with anger, but with precision. And then walk away. Go to the house, start again. Your life is your own design. Make it a good one. Love, Dad. Isabella finished reading. The tissue in her hand was a shredded mess. She looked from the letter to the key, then back to my face. The fury was gone. The confusion was gone. All that was left was a vast, empty understanding. He knew, she whispered. All along, he knew. He saw what I refused to see, I corrected. He gave you a chance. He gave us a chance, a path to redemption, but it was a path you would have never taken. You would have laughed at this key. You would have been horrified by that little house. And we both knew it was the truth. She looked down at the divorce papers. Then she looked at the letter from my father. It was a choice between the world she wanted and the world that was real. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, she took the pen I offered her. She didn't even read the papers. She just signed her name on the final page. Isabella Vance. for the last time. A year has passed. The Vance name is no longer a fixture in the society pages. It's a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. Marcus and Eleanor live in a condo in Florida. Their world shrunk to the size of a golf course and early bird specials. Julian, after a brief and humbling stint working for one of my logistics companies, disappeared to Southeast Asia, trying to find himself. Isabella, I hear, is working for a nonprofit. She lives in a small apartment. She's dating, I'm told, a high school teacher. I hope she is happy. I hope she has learned to value things that last. I'm standing in front of my father's house. It's just as he described it. Small, solid, in a neighborhood of nearly identical houses. The paint is a little faded. The front yard could use some work. But it's real. I still have the key he left me, but I haven't used it. I don't need to. The house was never the point. The foundation was. My own life is different now. My firm is more successful than ever, but we're taking on different kinds of projects. Libraries, schools, a community arts center. I'm building things that matter, not just things that impress. My fortress of wealth is still there, but it's become a tool for construction, not demolition. I often think about that final instruction from my father. Your life is your own design. Make it a good one. It's a simple sentiment, but it's a profound one. We are all architects of our own lives. We can build on sand, creating glittering, fragile structures that are bound to collapse. Or we can dig deep, find the bedrock of our own integrity, and build something that will last, something true. The pain of betrayal fades. The satisfaction of revenge is fleeting. But the quiet strength that comes from knowing your own worth, from building a life on a foundation of your own making, that is a structure that can withstand any storm. What do you think? Was the father's plan an act of love or an act of control? And what would you have done in my shoes? Let me know in the comments below. Your stories and your perspectives give me a foundation of a different kind, a community. Thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider liking and subscribing. There are always more blueprints to share.